as a startup person. I've been at that over a couple decades. In the last decade, I've been part of 5 different M&As, as well as other successful exits. Unfortunately, it's not always successful, although there's a lot of learning to be had there as well. I took everything that I've been doing, and for the last 4 years, I've been on my own running a business called Build, Scale, Grow, where I work with partners and different experts to come in and help startups to scale and grow. Typically, they've achieved some sort of traction, either product market fit or service market fit, but sometimes it's still at the ideation stage. And we talk about, okay, where do you want to be in 2 or 3 years? And what are a couple things you can do now, even as you're thinking about different ideas, to position yourself better towards that end goal? I always keep in mind that over 90% of startups fail, so it's important to surface how we do things and how we take care of ourselves, and that'll come up several times in this discussion. I've written a 500-page manual called Scale, Reach Your Peak. It's designed to cover 130 different topics across the spectrum of scaling your business, and it's all very modular. So don't worry, you don't have to read more than 5 to 7 minutes to get out of it what you want. Public relations, sales, financial modeling, leadership skills, etc. You pick the topics you want, but that's one way that I came at this, is compiling a bunch of different thoughts and articles. And then finally, I just want to say that I am an introvert, as I teased earlier. So while hopefully that means I'm thoughtful and reflective, I don't want you ever to perceive me as aloof and judgmental. So if I'm pausing before I answer, or if I look off because I concentrate better, then please forgive me. I'm really trying to be here with you, and I might need an extra second before I respond. So let me dig into the premise. I'll get into the first of 5 topics, and then I'll really pause for some length for any questions to come in at that point. Unless, Karen, you say there's something burning in the chat and I should pause for a moment now. Okay, so let me set up the premise here. One is that the only certainty about the future is that you as a founder will be involved. You may not necessarily become an entrepreneur, or may not always be an entrepreneur. You will always have agency over your own life. Everything else is unpredictable. The economy, the market, different stakeholders in your life, different team members you work with. So I want to encourage you to really hone your priorities to make the best choices available right now, so that as you're moving forward, things come up unexpected, completely unexpected, nobody ever imagined, you're still thinking about where you hold agency. And so the 5 different areas we'll talk about here are planning, seeking advice, focusing, self-awareness, and optimization. And like I mentioned, I'll stop after each one to entertain any questions, and hopefully we'll have some back and forth discussion. I promise you, no one here, including myself, wants to hear me talk the whole time. So I really do encourage questions. Let me dive into planning, and then I will really pause and give everyone a few minutes to jump in. So around planning, I encourage founders, and again, this doesn't necessarily apply only to entrepreneurs, but in talking about founders, I encourage you to dig into your founder problem fit. That is, what really drives you? Why are you doing this? And by all means, please don't make this a bunch of, well, my family told me I should. My friends tell me there's lots of money here. I think this is important. Really make sure you own it. Whether it's talking about it with many people and feeling good every time you talk about this problem and how you're going to solve it, or you get energized at coming up with the problem solution, and you think, whether it's nights, weekends, whenever you really want to tackle this, be very clear about your vision and your values. You're going to revert to those as times are tough. So you want to come in very headstrong. Think about different scenarios, how your future will play out. So think about what you expect. Think about if things do not go as well as expected, and think about if things are actually better than expected. Most people think, well, that's awesome, that's fantastic. But as a founder and as a supporter of founders, I'm here to tell you or remind you that that can actually be just as scary, in fact, even more scary than things not going as well. Because if things are going exceptionally well, you have a whole host of new problems, different people, different stakeholders, different expectations, different scaling issues that you're going to have to manage. With each of those scenarios, think about budgets, and that might be money, that also might be your time and your energy, and then come back to those budgets at least on a quarterly basis. Some people do that monthly, and think about, if you're running the scenario you're in now, are you on track? Do you have to make adjustments? And the reason you think ahead towards budgeting your time and your money is that you want to have some ideas when you're not under stress, and then you can pull on those ideas. You're going to need others too based on your situation, but you want to have some ideas to start. And then think about what data you want to collect and when you want to measure it. So all along, you're gathering new information, you're correcting course, you're making adjustments. The more often and the more frequent you think about the information that's coming in, the more you can adapt and adjust as needed. And an example here is, last year I talked with a lot of founders. They had amazing plans for 2023. They were all excited. And then, of course, the financial markets, the banking crisis, and other situations really did a number on most founders who were not prepared for what happened. Probably 99.5% are under where they expected to be. Another handful found themselves in a better situation, and that's great for them, but again, a whole host of new problems. But hopefully they did some scenario planning beforehand, because it was very stressful, especially Q1 and Q2 of this year. So let me pause. Aaron, if you want to let me know any questions that came up, or if somebody wants to just jump in and start us off, that would be great too.
Right now, there's no questions in the chat.
Okay. I think planning is pretty straightforward. And so unless somebody had a specific situation where they're looking in the rear view window and wondering, what could I have done a little differently to have had a better outcome? It's a little bit harder to talk about the future because it's so unknown. But this idea of really planting your foundation, being really clear about what's important to you, and then constantly revisiting the information so that you have a sense of what's changed and what's the same, so that you can make more informed decisions. That's going to be really useful going forward. And some of the way that you're going to be collecting data is in my second talking point around seeking advice. So a lot of people believe that repetition is the key to peak performance, but actually that will get you to a certain point, but that 10,000 hours of effort might get you to be much better at something, but it likely will not get you to be a thought leader. It will not get you to be an expert. It will not get you to be a world champion. For you to really push your boundaries and to keep developing as a leader, you are going to need to seek outside advice. So you're going to have people who are supportive of you no matter what, friends, family, past colleagues, and you're having a tough time, you're having a good time. They're saying, oh, that's great, keep going. And that's wonderful. Hopefully we all have that. Definitely we all need that from time to time. But I'm talking about people who are really going to challenge you to push further, to do more, to think differently. Adam Grant, the organizational psychologist, calls this a challenge network. You can call this group whatever you want, but you want anywhere from 3 to 7 people who you respect, but you may not necessarily like, but they're going to push you to keep doing better, to think differently, to understand what are the boundaries you're facing, what are the problems that you're not addressing, what is unconscious that you need to bring conscious. But you really need people in your life who are going to challenge you and push you to do better. And again, the key distinction there is not around candor, but around being constructive. If those people are pushing you, but you sense there's an underlying motive, or they're pushing you, but in a sense, they're kind of pushing you down, they're not trying to push you up, be very mindful of that, because people will take that position in life. But I'm talking about people who are being candid and being constructive and giving you the feedback that you need to hear, even if it's not exactly what you want to hear in the moment. And an example around that I thought of was Brian Chesky, the CEO of Airbnb. He very early on got advice from Paul Graham, who is the co-founder of Y Combinator. And that advice was not to go wide, but to go deep. And I think the quote is something like, focus on 100 people who love you versus 1 million people who like you. And Brian hadn't originally thought that way when formulating Airbnb, but with that piece of advice, it sort of confirmed some of his own thinking, and he really emphasized the relationships in the business. When they struggled during COVID, Brian made the hard decision to reimburse any renters who were owed money, even if that cost Airbnb a ton of money at a time when they faced, I think, 25 or 30% layoffs. But he felt that was really important to uphold his original vision and values, and he stuck with that. It's not only been a successful journey for him so far, but I really get the sense that he's at peace with the way that he's running his business. So let me pause again, see if that has sparked any questions, or, by the way, any other thoughts. Like if we haven't nearly covered what you wanted and you're like, hey, what about this or that? Feel free to interject, because I want to keep you engaged versus just me rambling on.
Benjamin, we do have a question in the chat from about planning, if I can go back to that. Somebody asked about what about targeted to-do lists, and should you aim for the hardest task first or the easiest? I love that question.
So it's interesting. I used to always follow the wisdom of Mark Twain, which is eat a frog first and the rest of your day will be easy, which is to say, do the hardest thing first. But I have evolved my thinking, because there are experts out there who say that. And there are other experts who say with the hardest thing, you might need to put it in the time of day when you have the best energy cycle. I'll get into this a little bit more later, but you think that we as humans have our evolutions of energy. There are some people who are energetic 20 hours a day. But for those of us who are normal humans, we might be morning people. We might have a lot of energy and steam in the afternoon. We might do our best thinking and creativity and deep work in the evening. So I would say with the hardest problem you're facing, block out the time when you have that energy cycle and say, hey, I'm going to need half an hour. I'm going to need 2 hours. I'm going to dig into this. I'm going to solve it. But it is now blocked out. I'm going to tell my friends, my family, my coworkers, I need this 2 hours. I'm going to be focused on this, and then use that time to dig in. So you have addressed it first thing of the day, or maybe the evening before, in that you know when you're going to tackle it, but then you dive in when you're best suited to solve that problem. So again, feel free to take, eat a frog first advice, or to do that time blocking if you feel like, hey, that makes a lot of sense. I often try to solve problems in the morning, but I'm actually an evening thinker. And then look, if there are other stakeholders involved, tell them that's really important. I understand you're concerned. I've actually blocked out some time later today to look at that. I will get back to you by midnight or by first thing tomorrow morning. Set that expectation with others, because that's important, and then really do it to your optimization. Hopefully that answered the question. Any others, Karen?
Not in the chat, but I will ask a question about seeking advice and where to find candid advice. There's so many people that are afraid to be candid with you. It's almost like the closer you are to somebody, the more reluctant they might be to be candid. So do you have any suggestions of where somebody could go to build that kind of network?
Sure. One thought on where and another thought on how, which is the beginning part of your question. So the where, I would say, ideally, you find somebody who is 2 to 3 years ahead in their journey where you want your journey to be. So if you're a seed stage entrepreneur, find somebody who went through their Series A about a year ago. If you're just at the ideation phase, find that late seed entrepreneur. It doesn't necessarily have to be in your industry. I am biased here. I talk to a lot of founders who believe that only people in their industry can understand their business. I take a very contrarian point of view. As somebody who's worked across many industries, I promise you 95% of the problems are the same. And then there's the 5% that's tailored to your industry, to your audience. I get that. There's going to be some differentiation, but a lot of the problems you're going to struggle with as a founder, a lot of other founders have struggled with similar problems. And in fact, it could be helpful to you to work with people in other industries because now they're coming at it with a fresh perspective. If you look at a polarity of Nobel Prize winners in science, many of them actually started off in one field and then jumped into another field. And because they were grounded in one form of science, but not biased by their new form of science, they were actually able to solve problems that other people in their field were unable to tackle. So really rely on that diversity. And then the other part of that is diversity of background. If you can, find people who have a different experience in life because they're coming into the same problems or close problems with a very different perspective than you might have. And that could be really interesting. And then I implied in your question, Karen, was a how. How do you sort of introduce yourself to these people? How do you find out if they're truly going to be helpful? And what I've learned is that if I start off being a little vulnerable in my conversations, this is not exactly like a first date, but maybe a third or fourth date where you're willing to open up a little bit more. You're not going to go in your, 6-month relationship and really get deep into your issues. But, by the third or fourth date, you might talk a little bit more openly about yourself. You feel really comfortable. And you say, hey, I'm struggling with this. I'm having a hard time with this other thing. This really bothers me. I don't know if I did the right thing. If the person comes back and they're like, oh, don't worry, like that happens to all founders, then fine, like they're in the support category. If they come back and say, oh yeah, that's real, and actually it's happened to me 5 times, this is what I've learned, and they're giving you candid advice while recognizing that it's a real issue for you, then hey, they could be somebody that would be great for your challenge network. So that's a great way to tease it out. And you can even be mildly vulnerable in your opening conversation, to your level of comfort. But I like to see how people respond to that to indicate if they're going to be a good challenge person.
Great, thanks. We do have another question. That's great to hear. I like that third or fourth date type of analogy. So we have another question in the chat. How do you take different founder stories and apply them to your own idea and business? That's sort of part 1 of this. And then part 2 is some founders often talk about constant rejection before having a breakthrough moment, while others talk about the importance of leaving behind a bad idea quickly. How do you navigate the different advice that people give you? Yeah.
I love these questions. It's interesting. They're almost 2 different perspectives on the same idea of how do you know what you're doing is taking you on the right path. If I had the magical, easy answer for that, then I would be a part of the Billionaire Club because there is no simple answer to that. But I would say that it comes back to your vision and values. Whether you're successful or whether you're challenged, you're going to be tempted to stray the course. If you feel like your problem is still worth solving, and if you feel like you can make a suitable living by solving that problem, then I would say that's where you start to say, I'm going to stick to it. So if you have other founders and they come at you with other variations of what you can do and other stories, definitely try to understand that. It's the hallmark of a bright mind, of being able to hold 2 different thoughts at the same time. So understand where they're coming from, why they came to that conclusion. Are there parts of what they're saying that would help you to solve your problem? Like, for example, you might not agree with where they ended up, but you might appreciate 1 or 2 of the processes they put in place in order to get there, and you might be able to adapt that in what you're doing. You might be able to experiment and try something new. I'll talk more about that later, but the idea of experimenting is very powerful as a way to test new ideas. So I would incorporate that. The idea of constant rejection versus leaving a bad idea, again, that's really difficult. First, I would start with your vision and values, but that has to be reconciled against, living your life. You have a certain lifestyle that you probably want to keep, whether that's a roof over your head or whether that's a fancy roof over your head. That's for you to decide, but everybody has their own circumstances. So there are trade-offs there. There are some founders who are very passionate about doing what you love and stick to it no matter what. And frankly, they probably got very lucky along the way as well. So the example I like to use is Mark Zuckerberg. I think he's brilliant, no matter what you think of his personality. His technical knowledge and his ability to grow a business is brilliant. But had he gone to Harvard 4 years earlier, or had he gone there 4 years later, I don't think any of us would have ever heard of Facebook. He was extremely lucky to get there at a time where the idea had some recognition, where people were talking about it. He could pull from some other places. He happened to be lucky that he was around people where maybe he borrowed an idea or two from them in order to form Facebook. That wouldn't have happened, years earlier, years later. And then finally, 5 years later, MySpace or another platform would have broken out. They would have pivoted in that direction. So yes, he's brilliant, hardworking, all those things that founders who seem to be successful talk about, but also he was very lucky. So that's important to keep in mind. And then the last piece of this puzzle is make sure you're not doing something that everybody says is going to make you successful, but you're going to feel miserable in the process. So if everybody's saying you have to work 20 hours a day, but you're going to be miserable and you think you can do this working 8 hours a day or 10 hours a day, put that other noise aside. There are a lot of brilliant people who need relaxed time in order to be creative, in order to break through and have those ideas. Be very mindful of what you need for yourself. So I'm sorry, I did not necessarily answer your question head on with the perfect physics formula for how to persevere, but I hopefully introduced some ideas of how you personally are going to persevere in your journey.
Great. Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Any other questions before I get into focus area?
Yeah, there's another one just came up. For founders just starting, it seems the safest strategy is to start small and scale by looking at which products sell well. Do you have additional advice to add to this strategy and to avoid remaining a mom and pop shop?
Sure. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. My personal bias is that I agree with that strategy. I also am against getting investment until you are very clear that you will get an exponential return on that investment. So I feel like there's a lot of pressure, both from existing founders who are later stages and certainly from investors to take an investment. These people have their own bias. Investors want you to take investment, because that's how they make money, right? Other founders who are in later stages, sometimes they're successful, but a lot of times they are of the opinion that that is the only way. And I'm not quite sure that's true. Again, this comes back to your time horizon. If you're going to start small, develop a product, build an audience, make sure this is an amazing product market fit, and take that time carefully, you are going to have a longer runway, but you're going to maintain a lot of your equity. You're going to struggle for resources, but you're going to be able to keep all the decision making in-house. There are lots of trade-offs here, but at the end of the day, I feel like if you feel passionate about something and then you develop a product or service in order to solve that, and then people are willing to pay money for that eventually, then investors will come to you. And that's an amazing place to be, because now you can decide if that option is right for you. And then the final point I'll just lay out, everyone here is probably ambitious towards entrepreneurism. I think it's a great lifestyle. It's intriguing and fascinating to me, of course. But there are many people who start off, they build a company, they get to a certain size, and that's okay. Lifestyle business where you have a great lifestyle, you're doing what you love, but you realize that in order to take it to the next level, you're going to make yourself miserable. You're going to have to cede control. You're going to have to give up your company. Those are, again, trade-offs that you might not be looking to make. So, that is a fine option for some people.
Great.
Cool. Anything else? Any other questions? Okay, we're good.
Yep, we're good.
Okay, sorry. So let's talk about number 3, which is focus. So a lot of founders, a lot of people in general, but a lot of founders get really focused on what is immediately in front of them. Responding to emails, going to meetings, delivering the latest project, figuring out, what it is that needs to get done right now. And I really encourage founders to shift their attention on a regular basis to working on the business and not in the business. So that is dedicating time to thinking only strategically about how you can grow the business, expand the business, new ideas. It really requires a little bit of splitting off your thinking. You have to ignore for the moment that you're the one who's going to have to implement a large part, if not 100% of the decisions you make. You're going to have to put that aside, and you're going to have to think, okay, what does this company need in order to go in the direction that I want, in order to solve the problem more impactfully? So that's part of it. Another part, as you're growing the business, even as you bring in 1 or 2 people, you're really going to want to think about how you delegate effectively. Now, sometimes people think, well, delegation, that's not really an issue until you're 150, 500 people, et cetera. I would encourage you right away to think about what you're going to delegate. That might be hiring, the $10 an hour offshore virtual assistant. That might be hiring an attorney, an accountant, a designer to work for a couple hours. But really think about how you're going to delegate responsibilities where you're going to lose traction, where you're not going to be the best person to solve it. And by bringing in those other people, it's going to cost a few dollars, but it's going to move you ahead by, 6 weeks, 6 months, et cetera. And then the final point, which I teased earlier, think about running experiments. So you have these times where you're thinking strategically about the business, you have a breakthrough idea, or you're talking with your challenge network and they say, hey, this is something you should try. For those of you, it's been a while since you took a science class. I'll break it down really easily. You want to think about your hypothesis, your expected outcome, then you want to measure the results. And then based on what you find from that initial experiment, you decide, do you want to double down? Do you want to change the dependent variable? Or do you want to just stop running this experiment because even after 4 weeks, you can tell it's not going to work out? So most things in life, you can run an experiment for 4 weeks to 3 months tops and get a sense of if that's going to get the right traction or not. So I really encourage founders at all stages, but particularly where you're at, think about running a few experiments. Don't go crazy and run 10 experiments because then you're going to lose, concentration, but run a few experiments and see what works effectively. The example I would give here, Slack originally was a gaming company, but the founder, Stuart Butterfield, he recognized that there was an opportunity to create a communication platform for businesses, same as they were doing internally. And he saw how much his employees loved it. And he's like, oh, well, maybe I could, actually pivot and start to sell this as a product. So he was able to step back, look at the big picture, and recognize that opportunity. And obviously, that's where Slack is at today. Let me pause on this and see if it sort of generated any new questions. And then we'll keep going.
May I?
Please.
On the point of figuring out what the right now versus shifting attention, it's a bit of a sort of chaos where I'm trying to juggle what's the most important thing to do immediately. Any guidance you have on how to keep that balance? I anticipate it may be a similar response to the push through versus abandon concepts quickly answer. But if you have any other guidance on when I look at work on or work in the business, because it both has to get done, or it all has to get done. And sometimes working in the business seems like, well, we have to do something right now versus the macro strategy.
Sure. So Garrett, if I was an academic, I would say the balance is 80-20, working in versus working on. But instead, I'm a founder who spends most of the time working with other founders. And I'd say realistically, it's going to be 95% in the business and 5% on the business. And that on the business can be you putting yourself in a quiet room for an hour and thinking through all the things happening and what could be different. That's what I do as an introvert. But somebody who's more extroverted or somebody with a great challenge network might spend an hour going to the person or two in their network saying, in the last 3 months, this is what we've done. This is where I've spent 60% of my time. This is where I see myself next quarter. What are your thoughts? And working on it that way. You definitely, though, want to carve out some of those opportunities because whether it is internal brainstorming and creativity or external brainstorming and generating new ideas, and by the way, new networking opportunities as you're pivoting, you want to have other inputs to reinforce what you're doing well and to sort of change what you're not doing. So I would say roughly 95%, 5% is probably the mix you'd be looking for. Yeah, sure. Anyone else?
All right. No questions in the chat, so we're good.
Okay, great. So let me jump into number 4, self-awareness. So self-awareness is something that you might have heard here or there. Maybe some of you practice this in your own way, but I think it's really important to bring up. Again, the premise of this whole discussion is how to manage through uncertain times, and self-awareness helps you to lead through those times because, one, it helps you deal better with the pressure, sort of taking your own temperature, knowing where you're at. 2, it helps you to grow work relationships. So if you take the time to step back and think, oh, what was I bringing to that interaction with my co-founder, and why do they seem kind of turned off right now? Or what could I have done better in that board presentation? And you can learn from that. And then 3, it'll help you to improve decisions because obviously you're going through a couple of your activities or you're gauging yourself and figuring out what could you do better next time so that you're more present, you're more energized, and therefore everybody else gets something out of it. So with self-awareness, I think of this both in personal and interpersonal terms. So you might be interested and willing to do writing or journaling. I know a lot of people have a hard time with journaling every day. Personally, I do it once a week. I keep a gratitude journal. I put down 3 or 4 things that I'm really thankful for that have been happening in my life. It can be around work, it can be personal, but it's fantastic to put those on paper. I literally write it down. It's a good mnemonic in this computer age. And I think, oh man, it's great to revisit that and have that moment. Other ways are hold yourself accountable. You'll have your own milestones. Be very clear in those objectives so that you're able to measure it later. Some people practice mindfulness or reflection or breathing techniques. Those are all very valid forms of self-awareness. And then interpersonally, I talked earlier about seeking advice. I mentioned there, and I'll reinforce here, go to diverse people, people with different backgrounds, different life stories, different careers. Maybe they're founders at different paths in their journey. Maybe they're not founders at all, but you find them incredibly compelling. Go to them and talk to them about some of the problems you've faced. You can even have solved that problem, but go back to them and say, hey, I'm afraid this could come up again. I didn't have the best solution. Can I walk through what I did? And you give me 1 or 2 pieces of advice of how I could have done better. Also, pick up different media. Go to new places. Again, it's this idea of diversity of inputs. So as you're reading nonfiction, or if you love nonfiction, you never touch fiction, I really encourage you, pick up a fiction book and, once a month, go through it. It's going to really force your brain to think a different way. And it's the same with media. There's lots of different media sources now, but make sure you're going to, podcasts and Twitter feeds and other sources that aren't your norm, because you want to hear different ideas that might generate something really useful in your journey. The example that I would use here is Ben Chestnut, the co-founder and CEO of MailChimp. He recognized and he called out that he really needed to improve his communication skills and he needed to delegate more effectively. And of course, there's a certain irony in the CEO of MailChimp needing to communicate better. But he recognized that and he called it out. And in so doing, he allowed others to support him, to give him feedback. I don't work with Ben Chestnut. Others who work with him directly might feel differently. But my hunch is that in going through that process and seeking feedback, he's a much better leader of a company that has grown very nicely. So that was really important in his journey. And I just encourage you all to think about that in yours. Any other thoughts or questions around self-awareness? All right. I'm not hearing anything.
No,
so
there's nothing in the chat. So yeah, we can.
Okay, and for my fifth point, optimization, I do hope there's more interaction here, because I will give you the end point, which is what tips and techniques do you have for productivity and for resilience? But I will start off offering some of mine, and I'll come back in a couple minutes and ask for yours. So I love taking a growth mindset when it comes to all the trials and tribulations that we face. And a growth mindset says we can always improve, we can always learn. It takes a long-term view. When something happens to you, it can be horrible, it can be scary, but often we'll get through it. For some people, it really helps to think about what are some horrible, scary things that have happened in the past, and recognize that you got through those, and then say, okay, I will get through this. It might take longer than I want. It might be more painful than I hope, but I will get through this. So then you say, okay, what can I learn from this? What can I take away? Not that you're immediately, taking notes on the long term as you're, putting out a fire. But what I mean to say is give yourself that moment to say, I will learn something from this. I will grow from this. And if you take that mindset, most of the problems and situations you face will be a notch less imposing, knowing that you're going to gain something, even though it's horrible right now. The second thing I encourage, and this actually is to repeat a point from earlier, think about your energy levels. Some people think that money is the most limited resource. Some people think it's time, but I would argue that energy is actually the most finite resource. We as humans might be able to increase our money. We might be able to effectively increase our time by being able to delegate more and more as we build a business, but our own energy is always going to be finite. For some people, it's a few hours a day when they're at the peak of their energy. Like I said, some people can fire on all cylinders for many hours, but those people who pretend to be highly energetic for 20 hours a day, they will burn out. They will be the sad success stories that you hear about in 5 years, where they are literally like, they look almost vacuous in their eyes. And you're like, oh, they're so successful. They raised and they made $100 million and they must be so happy. And you just look at them and they're literally a walking zombie. And they might recover, with that kind of money and resources, but they may never recover from what they've gone through. They might have a permanent post-traumatic stress disorder from, that burst of energy that never stopped. So I encourage you, think about your energy levels, what works for you, and then put the hardest tasks in those when possible. And then think about productivity tips. For me, I use my calendar as a to-do list. I don't have a separate to-do list. Everything important goes in my calendar. If something else important comes up, it's got to either move something that's there or it's got to replace something that's there. But the calendar reminds me there are only so many working hours in the week, and I have to make some choices. And by using it as my to-do list, it really force functions triage. So I'm making the decisions that matter the most. And I'm using that strategic time to come back and say, hey, am I working 5 or 10% on the strategic side, to that question earlier? And also think about habits around resilience, your physical health, your mental health. I'm not going to spend a lot of time with it here, but it's so important. This is a marathon. It's not a sprint. I know we hear that all the time, but what that means is you have to take time every day to take care of your physical self and your mental self. And if you feel like that's falling off balance, you have to go back to your calendar and block it out. Again, you don't want to be that person who everybody else thinks is successful and you come out of this miserable. You come out of this with severe mental health problems. You come out of this so exhausted, you don't even recognize your family and your friends anymore. I'm pretty sure none of us want to be that person in the aspiration of what somebody else thinks is successful. So really think about healthy habits around resilience. Sorry, I think that was 3 or 4 minutes instead of 2. But now I want to hear from everybody here. One tip or one technique that you have around productivity and resilience, and I look forward to learning from you.
So there is something in the chat that maybe is a strategy or technique. What about building collaborations during times of adversity to help weather a storm together while adding value to both parties? Could fall under outside advice with added benefits for both businesses.
Yes, no, I love this idea, and I think it takes a couple shapes. One is a founder who perhaps is more closely in your situation, or you just easily identify with, and you might rely on that person, and they turn to you as well, really for kind of venting what's going on, talking through the problems, but not necessarily solutioning. I recognize that I might have this male bias of always trying to find the results versus managing the process, but I recognize all of us, myself included, need to have times where we just talk through what's going on. We're not necessarily looking for an answer or a result. So that collaboration could work there. The second type could be more of a business collaboration where maybe somebody's working with the same target audience, but they're not competing with you. So for example, in my work, I work with fractional CTOs, fractional CROs. I work with attorneys. I work with accountants. They are often targeting the same audience, but they are providing very different services. And I love to talk with them about what they're seeing in the market, what solutions they're finding, and maybe that can cross over in my learning and in my conversation. So if I'm working with clients, I say, hey, that sounds like the type of problem that I know this accountant could solve or this CTO could solve. So I think it works both ways in your personal resilience and in your professional growth.